Welcome to your Watercolor Basics tutorial video. The first thing I want to talk about is watercolor paper. So I have specified that you purchase cold press watercolor paper. What that means is it has some texture on the front of each page, and that just helps the watercolor grip onto the paper a little bit better. The other option is hot press watercolor paper. It's very, very smooth in texture, which is nice for lettering and things like that. But for our purposes, we like the texture, so that's why we will be using this watercolor paper. Beyond that, I wanted to talk a little bit about taking care of your brushes and your materials. Everything's really easy to clean because it's water-based. So at the end, when you're finished, all you really need to do, rinse out your brush thoroughly, make sure all the bristles are clean. You might want to use some running water to do that, and then you can just dry it off in a paper towel, sort of reshape your bristles, and then store them in a nice spot. You'll notice if you purchased these and probably any watercolor brushes, they might come with this little plastic sleeve. You could keep them in that sleeve for as long as you can. That might help protect the tips as well, but you just don't want to store them with a bunch of other things and then have the bristles ruined. You want to take as good care of the bristles as you can. That'll help you be more specific and detailed if you keep your brush points in good shape. The other thing you don't want to do in terms of bristles is to leave your brush sitting in your water pan like this, because it will start to shape to that, so you never want to do that. You always want to take it out and just set your brush to the side. Otherwise, what's also nice about watercolor is, see, I've mixed a color here and it started to dry, but because it's water-based, even if it's completely dry, you can just add a little water and it reactivates the color, and you can continue using the color that you mixed. So it's kind of a unique feature of watercolor. Now we're going to move into learning about washes, and washes is basically putting a field of color on the paper. We're going to talk about a couple different types of washes. There's the wet on wet method, and what that means is you first get water loaded onto your brush, and then you create a field of water on your paper. It's a little hard to see. And then you pick a color. Let's just use this ultramarine blue. And you load up the color onto the brush, and then you add the color to the water that you previously put on your paper. Now, one thing about watercolor that I've noticed is different for students to kind of grasp is it's usually better just to apply a layer, let it dry, and then add more and more layers. I think the layering is a different thought process than using acrylic. So since you're working in layers, usually you start with your lightest colors and then you build up the layers. So maybe you start with yellows, and then you'll keep adding darker and darker colors. So maybe if you're drawing grass, there's some yellow highlights. So you start with the yellow, then you add the midtones, the greens, and then you add the blacker, darker colors for the shadows. And that's the order that you would do that in. So what would happen is you would add your yellow, and you make your layer, but you really want to make your layer and then just let it be. You don't want to overwork the watercolor, okay? So the more I sit here and mess with it, sometimes the more the paper gets really gummy, so that's one disadvantage. Then also you kind of lose some of that wonderful watercolor texture that you might be looking for. So sometimes it's nice just to let it bleed and do what it wants to do, and then when it dries you can come back and add more and more layers. So next is the wet on dry method. So that one's a little more straightforward. You load up your brush with the color, your paper's dry, so you're just adding the blue color. You might have to reload your brush. And see how I'm kind of working from left to right, and you always want to keep a leading edge, a wet leading edge. That's how you get a smooth surface. And you can start to see a little bit of a difference here. The wet on wet method gives you kind of a soft finish. The wet on dry, you can be a little more precise about the color. So let those dry, and you can really see the differences there. Beyond that, you got flat wash and then a graded wash. So pretty much what I've already done is a flat wash, but I'll just do another one. I'll pick this color here. The flat wash means that it's just all one solid color. And I'm going to talk again about keeping that leading edge that I'm pulling down as wet as possible. So you may need to go back, get more water. See it's still glistening there. Most of the time I think people want to use more pigment and less water, but it's really the other way around. More water, less pigment. It's really a little goes a long way. So I'm just pulling that water down. So see how I'm not getting a lot of lines from my brushes, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't. That's how watercolor works. You use the water to move the pigment. So this would be a flat wash. Now, graded wash is just probably what you're thinking already, is a gradient. So you might start with a heavily saturated color at the top. I'm going to really load up my brush there. And then add more water. And see how it's bleeding down like that. Now the other thing that you want to be careful of is color bleeding. So when I mentioned using multiple colors and layers, you're going to want to let one layer dry before you add another layer. So if I start with this yellow here, we got that nice yellow color, and then say I have something blue next to it, I can't really just add the blue over top. It's going to muddy the yellow. So you have to wait for the yellow to dry first, which is what I've done here. This one's already dry. So I'm going to grab that blue again, and see, I can put the blue adjacent to the yellow, and it does not bleed in the same way. And then for layering, kind of makes a nice green when I cross those two, and I can keep the edge crisp. I think that you'll benefit from practicing these different methods and just testing out your watercolor in a sheet like this. Get familiar with your colors, and then you can move on to the color wheel assignment.